For Mining Weekly, I'm Lugile Nkomfe. Joining me is author and renowned geologist Professor Richard Viljoen, here to discuss his book titled Reading the Rocks: Adventures of Twin South African Geologists. Your book covers the distinguished careers that you and your now late twin brother, Professor Morris Viljoen, had as geologists working in South Africa's mining industry. To start, can you please briefly tell us about your family history, dating back to the Huguenots' arrival in Franschhoek in 1688, all the way to your upbringing in Johannesburg?
Yes, we thought we'd bring in a little bit of the family history, and as you say, we can trace our ancestry back to Francois Viljoen, who arrived in the Cape just before the main influx of the Huguenots, married a Dutch woman and had a number of children, and we are the descendants of one of the sons called Henning. And then the family kind of spread out both in the Cape and further north over the years. And we were very happy to know our grandparents who lived on a farm in the Karoo. So we had an upbringing within the family unit. And then we eventually settled. My father worked for the government, and we then settled in Johannesburg. And we then grew up in a suburb called Sydenham. And I think that's where our interest in geology was ignited. There's a feature there called the Orange Grove Hill, which is the Orange Grove quartzite, which is the basal unit of the entire sequence of the Witwatersrand, which contains the gold-bearing conglomerates. We didn't know that at that time, of course, but over time we got to know it, and we enjoyed climbing up that hill, which wasn't really too populated at that early stage. So yeah, that's more or less our early life, and we went to school in the area and then went to Wits University.
You've held a lengthy affiliation with Wits University. To what extent did your experiences as students and academics at this institution provide you and Morris with insights that you take on into your careers as geologists?
From the outset, I'd like to say that Wits was absolutely fundamental in shaping our careers as geologists. We had some remarkable lecturers. Professor Geologists was our professor at the time, and he was a real traveler. He traveled the world to study volcanoes and glaciers. That was his hobby, and he took students on many tours and so on. And in one of the tours, he was charged by this bull elephant, which destroyed the vehicle he was in, and badly broke his leg and so on. So he walked with a limp thereon. But it was that kind of film that he showed to students in the first year, and films of volcanoes and so on. And that got us really interested in the subject. We had many other lecturers, and one of the things at Wits was that it was part of the curricula to go on student tours. So that student tours would go, for example, to Zimbabwe. We went by train. We'd stop off at various stations, go by bus, visit mines, visit the metallurgical plants in the mines, and really got a good idea of what mining's all about. And we toured through Namibia, Southwest Africa as it then was. Also quite amazing, visiting all the famous mines in Namibia and Tsumeb and then O'Keepe in the Northern Cape, and another tour of the Northern Transvaal, etc. So a lot of these tours organized by the university. Another thing at Wits was that they would say, well, you're studying geology, you're probably going to end up in the mining industry, you now need vac jobs. So we would then go out and get a vac job. Now, these vac jobs were very, very important. And at that time, there were 7 major mining houses, the big 7. And they were very, very good in that they had jobs available for students in engineering, in mining, in geology, and other subjects. And they would employ students over that period. And we were employed by Anglo-American on one of their mines in the Klerksdorp area, and then by Union Corporation. we had to go underground, and to go underground in that time, you had to be fit, and you had to get what's called a red ticket to go underground. Anyhow, so we learnt about the practicalities of mining and geology, not just the theoretical side. And I think that was very important. We then did our honours degrees at WITS. And after that, we were offered research projects by what was called the Economic Geology Research Unit, which had been established by the Chamber of Mines to promote research, particularly on gold deposits in Africa and South Africa in particular. So I was given a job to study the mineralogy of the Witwatersrand gold-bearing reefs. I studied some 150 samples from all the mines in the old Central Rand goldfield, which was still operating in those days. And Morris, my brother, got a job in Barberton, studying the gold deposits in Barberton. So that was a very useful experience as well, doing MSc studies at WITS. So that was really the beginning of our careers. Just to complete the WITS story, we then were offered jobs by mining houses, in particular JCI. JCI, Johannesburg Consolidated Investment, offered us jobs on a nickel mine west of the Pilanesberg. And in the case of Morris, he was given the job of mapping the platinum-bearing Merensky Reef in the Eastern Bushveld. So that was also then practical experience of mining, etc., in the Bushveld. So having done our stint now in industry, our first jobs, for a period of about 2 years, we were again approached by the head of the Economic Geology Research Unit, Professor Des Pretorius, who was a fantastic mentor. And I should just say at this stage that mentors are extremely important in this mining game, both from the university point of view, the professors there and the lecturers, and also from in the mining houses. Like the first time you go underground to learn how to map, you've got to be with a geologist who knows what's going on, who knows how to keep safe underground. You have to know a lot of practical things. So this mentorship is absolutely vital. And I believe we need a lot more of this in these times as well. Anyhow, Des Pretorius from the Economic Geology Research Unit offered us research jobs to do PhD degrees at WITS. So we then went back to WITS and started on 4-year stints doing PhD studies. And the studies were carried out in the Barberton Mountainland, which was a fantastic area to map. It was quite hard work, climbing mountains every day and recording the geology on aerial photographs. Anyhow, we did that for 4 full field seasons of hard geological work, which I think set the scene for our further careers, understanding how to map and understand the relationship of rock formations, etc. That became highly important doing this field work. Incidentally, during that period, we discovered a brand new rock type. We found it right the way along the banks of the Komati River, and we called it Komatiite. And this rock type has now been discovered in all the ancient terrains of the world and is just sort of taken off. So we're very proud of having been the discoverers of this rock. It represents a very ancient lava, a very hot lava. So if you can imagine Hawaii and the lavas pouring out, some of them pouring into the sea, etc., those lavas pour out at a temperature of about 1600 degrees centigrade. But in the case of this Komatiite, they were very, very hot lavas because of their high magnesium and other chemical compositions, and almost total melts of the mantle, the layer below the crust of the earth. They flowed out at 1600 degrees centigrade. So it was a very, very tricky environment at that time. That was 3.5 billion years ago, though. So it was, anyhow, that was one of the highlights of the PhD studies.
Your careers as geologists have taken you and Morris to all corners of the world. Can you briefly mention some of the notable geological sites in South Africa and across the world that you explored in? And also reflect on the great mining personalities that you got to work with throughout your careers.
Yes, well, I think that was another highlight of our careers. We both were employed firstly by JCI, as I mentioned, and then we were re-employed by JCI when we finished our PhDs. And JCI had two major commodities that they were mining. Number one was platinum, and platinum was being mined by what was then called Rustenburg Platinum Mines, which is the forerunner, incidentally, of Anglo Plats. And the other big commodity that they were mining, in fact, producing, I think, about a quarter of the world's supply of antimony. Now, the antimony occurs in what's called the Murchison Greenstone Belt in the Gravelot area of the northeast Mpumalanga. So we both got heavily involved in working on these two commodities, platinum and antimony. But we had set up a research group. They wanted us to look at the fundamentals of finding new mineral deposits by using research and using different techniques. So that was our mandate. So the first thing, though, was any platinum or antimony occurrence anywhere in the world that sounded interesting, significant, JCI wanted to have part of because of their dominance in this field of antimony. So we were then sent all over the show. I spent, for example, about 2 months in New Zealand. Some guy had picked up all the antimony claims in the whole of New Zealand, from the south of the South Island to the north of the North Island. Spent 6 weeks, 2 months, examining these claims for antimony and so on. So we had a fantastic time in looking at the geology and the scenery of New Zealand and looking at antimony occurrences and associated with gold, incidentally. So that was a big story in New Zealand. The other thing that the mining houses did, they sent us on study tours. So that was really important as well. So we were on a study tour, Morris and I. We had done a boat trip to South America. And from the boat trip, we suggested, well, seeing you want us to research all these mineral deposits, we need to look at more mineral deposits. So we spent about a month in South America going to many of the major mineral deposits, particularly along the Andean belt of the Western South America. Again, looking at antimony prospects and often associated with gold and so on. Came back from New Zealand, then they said, there's another antimony field that has been offered to us in Turkey. So I then set off for Turkey and spent the next 2 years visiting Turkey on at least 8 occasions and getting involved with a drilling program. And we drilled a major antimony ore body there, which now has turned out to be antimony and Turkey's largest gold mine, incidentally. But it gave one the opportunity again of traveling around Turkey. What a beautiful, interesting country. Then I was, in subsequent years, working again for JCI, spent some time in South America, in Brazil, looking at antimony, and also along the Andean range in Bolivia. Then went to a conference in Australia and did a study tour of many of the big mines in Australia. So that gave us an idea of what is going on with the minerals in Australia. Later, I moved to Goldfields, and there, again, as chief geologist, I was involved in exploration and mining activities and prospect development all over. So we had a major project in India. So I spent a lot of time in India, which was an amazing country. Developed a little gold mine there for the company that we were in partnership with, but also had the opportunity of traveling around India. And then, of course, we were invited by the Gold Corporation of China, and then spent many trips to China examining gold deposits and subsequently platinum deposits in China, and developing joint ventures with Chinese, but also having the opportunity of doing tourist trips around China, to the terracotta soldiers and to the Li River and the karst topography. So there's so many interesting things in China. Morris then did a major job in France, visiting major antimony occurrences in France and tying up some of these as joint ventures with JCI at the time. In later years, a colleague of ours, or a friend from early Rhodesian days, had started a gold mining company on the Falkland Islands, of all places. So he said, could I go and have a look and see what I thought of it? So I spent an interesting couple of weeks on the Falkland Islands examining his gold project. And the Falkland Islands was previously part of the southeastern Cape of South Africa, but it moved away with continental drift, drifted south, and so that the gold mineralization is virtually identical to the gold mineralization that you get at the old Millwood goldfield in the Knysna area. So that was very interesting to see. Part of Africa had just moved away to virtually South America. We spent a very, very interesting trip to Iceland. Iceland is quite an amazing place because it's on a spreading center where the continents split apart, North America going to the west, Europe going to the east. And along that zone, you get various fissures developed. And along these fissures, you get volcanic activity and lavas pouring out. But you also get glaciers. So you get the land of fire and the land of ice together, which makes it an interesting environment.
Professor Viljoen, please discuss the significance of discovering komatiite in the Barberton Greenstone Belt.
It was called the Upper Mantle Project that we were working on. It was a worldwide project. And our particular brief was to study ultramafic rocks, in other words, high magnesium rocks in fold belts, okay? So Barberton was chosen as a good candidate because there are many ultramafic rocks in Barberton which have been mapped and so on. So we set about mapping some of these ultrabasic rocks, in fact, in many areas, and we found some of them in some areas had peculiar textures. They were fairly fine-grained, which is unusual, and they had these feathery kind of crystal growth, which we were not quite sure of. And in certain areas, you could see what are called pillow structures, okay? So when you extrude a lava into water, it'll form what's called a pillow, and these pillows stack up like sandbags, okay? And this is what happens in Hawaii, for example. You can see this happening. The only difference is that these rocks, their composition was very different to the normal lavas. They were what we call ultrabasic. In other words, as I mentioned, very magnesium rich and very hot, 1600 degrees centigrade. So at that time, people said there's no ways you could get an ultramafic lava pouring out on the surface of the earth. That's impossible because they're so hot, and they'd have to come up from the mantle and they'd cool down and all sorts of things. But here, 3.5 billion years ago, the crust of the earth was so thin that you could pop up these lava flows, very hot, and they're very liquid. They would flow almost like water. So they started erupting all over the show, giving you these huge piles of these ultrabasic lavas, okay? So that was the big breakthrough to recognize that they were lavas and they had a particular composition And that is the significance. And also, they carry very important elements that form ore deposits. So, for example, in Australia, soon after our discovery in South Africa, the Australians came along and said, mate, we've also got these commodites, yeah. And their commodites contain major nickel deposits. So the major nickel deposits of the Kambalda area in Western Australia are all in commodiite lava flows. But the Aussies were one up on us here because they also recognized these funny crystal growths, which we called crystalline quench textures, okay? And they look very, very similar to a spiky grass that you get in the outback of Australia. And that grass is called spinifex. So now that spiky texture then took on the name spinifex. So the name of the spiky texture comes from Australia, but komatiite, the name of the rock, was christened in South Africa. And as well as the nickel that occurs with the komatiite, we also believe that the komatiites were major carriers of gold in finely disseminated form and relatively low amounts from the mantle onto the crust. Those rocks were then metamorphosed and heated up again, and the gold was liberated, and that gold was eroded. And that, we think, eventually gave rise to this huge deposit of gold that we have here, the Witwatersrand. So we think komatiites are basically responsible for the gold in the Witwatersrand, but there have been various other concentrating processes to give you what we've got at the moment. So that's another fascinating field. A lot of work is being done on that at the moment. They carried the gold from the mantle up into the crust, where it could be reworked, concentrated, and eventually deposited as gold-bearing reefs, aided by the growth of very primitive life forms, which incidentally have been found in Barberton as well, unicellular, pretty close to the origin of life. And these life forms also occur in the Witwatersrand as carbon. And often the gold is closely associated with this carbon. So the carbon acts as a collector of gold as well, another concentrating mechanism. But the original gold was in the komatiites. Well, that's what we are now working on. So yeah, it's been a very important rock, and we're very proud to have been able to, stick our necks out and say this is a new rock type that hadn't really been properly described before.
In 1986, you were inducted as the president of the Geological Society of South Africa. Your presidential year marked the centenary of the discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand. What did your role entail? And in this role, how did you promote the study and advancement of earth sciences?
The role there in 86 was the centenary, as you say, of the discovery of the Witwatersrand. So we went around to all the mining houses, and all the major mining houses had very good operating gold mines at that time, and asked them to produce papers on descriptions of their gold and what they thought of the origin of their gold, etc., and how it occurred and so on. And from that, we brought out a volume on Witwatersrand Gold 100 Years. So that is a major contribution of that conference, was to bring out that volume. And then numerous studies evolved from that time as well. There had been studies previously, as I'd mentioned, when I did my MSc. It was part of one of the first wave of studies on the Witwatersrand. But this was like now a second wave was prompted by that centenary conference and the publishing of that book. So a number of projects got going connected to gold distribution, the origin of gold, etc., etc. And as we speak today, it's still ongoing, the debate about the origin of the gold. So it's been a pretty fascinating study all the way through. So I think that conference was important in promoting more research on gold.
For you and Morris, What were the most fulfilling periods in your careers as geologists?
I would say probably the work that we did down in Barberton for our PhDs, because we were let loose. We worked together. So the two of us would go out. They gave us only one vehicle, the CSR. We got accommodation in Butplass, which was close to our study area. And we would go out every day and with our aerial photographs and do traverses and study the rocks and so on. And one would go in one direction, other in the other, and come back. We would discuss what we had found. And slowly but surely, these discussions were very, very important because we could call a spade a spade. And if we disagreed with each other, we told each other in no uncertain terms that we disagreed. And, we actually would throw rocks at each other at times, which wasn't very good. But can you imagine doing that with a colleague? If you disagreed with your colleague and the guy would never speak to you again. So, but with a twin brother, all was forgiven at the end of the day. And now also very fulfilling is feeding back to people the joys of geology. So there's a very strong link to geoheritage. In other words, what geological heritage do we have in South Africa? Well, we have amazing heritage, both, from a scenic point of view. We have the Drakensberg, the Fish River Canyon area, the Blyde River Canyon. And there is this move now to develop what are called geoparks. And Morris and Morris was, I'm still heavily involved in developing geoparks, which will become major tourist attractions. We're working at the moment on the Blyde River Canyon. The other one we're working on is the Fort Dome, which you might have heard about. It's an ancient meteorite crater, about 2 billion years old. And all sorts of evidence there that show that the Earth was hit by this major meteorite at about that time. So that could become a major tourist attraction in a geopark. And I find this very fulfilling, taking tours. And Morris, in particular, did many tours to places of interest across the whole Witwatersrand, the history of the Witwatersrand, the history of the people, the landlords and the workers and the other people who actually created this gold field. So I think this education is very important now to me. So I enjoy doing that.
That was Professor Richard Viljoen discussing his book titled Reading the Rocks, Adventures of Twin South African Geologists.